Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a React app from scratch and connect it to a Flask API server, so Python Flask, and this is what we're going to build. So over here we have our app component, which makes an API call to our Flask server, which is running right here, and it returns all these users, and so under app component then receives these users and displays them all out here. And they both have live updates, so say I just type in some jargon like this, we can see it reflected here. If I update our Python server, say to add another user here and refresh it, we have to of course refresh our app, but we can see that also returned here. And we can see this API request with my Chrome extension right here. If I refresh here and capture all the requests that were made, if we look at this one and we send the request, this is what's being returned by our server, which we can see the request coming in here whenever I click send. But over here is our Webpack dev server, and over here is our Flask API server. And so before we start coding, I just want to go over just a quick view of the architecture of this. It's pretty simple, but it'll help you understand a lot more of what's going on. And so the way this is going to work is we have two different servers. We're going to have our Webpack dev server, which will be used to generate our React bundle and serve the React app to the client. And we'll also proxy API requests to our Flask server, because our Flask server is just going to be returning API data. Out in production, of course, you would just generate the React JavaScript file and index the HTML file and serve them up with something like Nginx. But of course, in development, you want to do it a little differently, and this will speed up your development process, make it a lot easier. But just know we have two different servers, and so whenever we make an API request, like inside our app component, this will be sent to our Webpack server, but it will proxy it to our Flask server. But this is what we're going to build in this video. Let's start coding. So to start this project, let's just have an empty directory. And the first thing we're going to do is create our environment variables. So I'm going to do this in file called .env. And this is going to contain information such as the location of our Flask server and also our Webpack server. So I'm going to paste in these values, but essentially we can see the host and port that our Flask server will be listening on, our API server, and the host and port that our Webpack server will be listening on. But now that's all there is there. Next, let's create our client folder, and this will hold all our stuff related to React. And I'm just going to cd into this folder. The first thing we're going to do is initialize this as an ES6 project with npm init es6-y. This will create our package.json file with the type set to module, so we can use more modern import and export syntax. Now let's start installing our libraries. The first thing we're going to install is React, because React is just a library like anything else. And then after that, we're going to install React DOM, which is essentially a package that acts as the glue between React and our DOM, or our HTML code. So we can see our packages populating our package.json file. And now let's start working with or installing Webpack. So all we need to do is install it as a development dependency with npm Webpack. And so what Webpack is, it's a module bundler. So essentially it'll take all our React code or our JSX code and turn it into code that the browser understands. So just native JavaScript that you would write in a JavaScript file. Webpack will take all that code, put it in a single JavaScript file that the browser will then understand. But Webpack also has a few dependencies, and one of them is Webpack CLI, which stands for Webpack command line, and it'll give us a set of commands to increase the efficiency of setting up a custom Webpack project. Next, we are going to install Webpack dev server. And this will give us a server to serve up our bundled up React code. So it'll serve up an HTML file and a JavaScript file, which will then render our React application. And it'll also give us some live reload whenever we make changes. So it'll make the development process much easier. But Webpack is basically a bit bare bones, meaning there are other stuff we need to install to get it to understand JSX or React code. And these are something called presets and loaders. And I'll paste them in right here. But essentially it's Babel preset env, Babel preset React, and Babel loader. And so essentially a loader is a function that Webpack passes code through to perform some sort of transformation. And the Babel loader is a Webpack loader that transpiles JavaScript code. So it's essentially going to be used to transform our React code to code the browser understands. And then we have these things called presets, which are basically used to configure the Babel loader or Babel transpiler. And preset env allows us to use the latest JavaScript, and preset React handles React code. But those are the loaders we have to install. The next thing we need to configure Webpack with is something called the HTML Webpack plugin. And a Webpack plugin is just something that interacts with the Webpack lifecycle. And this HTML Webpack plugin will create an HTML file to place our bundled JavaScript code into. So when Webpack takes all React code and turns it into a JavaScript file, we can then have this plugin, which will plug into Webpack's lifecycle and inject this code into the HTML file. But that's basically all the package installation for Webpack. Next, we need to create a configuration file for Webpack, which I'm going to call webpack.config.cjs. And we use CJS because we want to use actually require and module.exports here, even though we are in a ES6 type project. So CJS allows us to do that. And I'm just going to paste in everything, and I'm going to go over what all of it does. And actually, I just realized a package we forgot to install was something called .env, which essentially allows us to load environment variables into our application. And so what we do here is we just import our libraries. Then we are going to import our environment variables from our .env file right here. And now this object we export is going to be used to configure Webpack. And we have our mode set to development, target set to web because we're in a browser. We set our entry point to start building the bundle. So we're going to have let me just create it right now, a source and an index.jsx file. Webpack will essentially use this, find what other files it imports, and bundle them all together into a single JavaScript file that will render our React app. And the bundle that it outputs is determined by this output key. We're going to call it bundle.js, and we're going to place it inside a folder called dist. Then we can use the plugins key to specify our plugin, which remember we installed HTML Webpack plugin, which will inject this bundled code right here into an HTML file that we provide here as a template. And I'll also just create that real quick. It's just going to be index.html. Then after down here, we have our dev server key, and this is used to configure the Webpack development server, so that server that we installed not too long ago. And essentially what it does is we give it a host and port, so where it's going to be running, and then static is where it will serve up, or the location of the static content that it's going to serve up. And we are generating a bundle.js file and an index.html file and putting them inside a dist folder. So we want our dev server, we want to provide the location of that dist folder to our dev server so we can serve up those files from there. However, we also set this proxy key, which is important because we're going to be having two servers in this, remember. We're going to have our Webpack server, which will bundle or generate our React app, and then we're going to have our Flask server, which will handle all our API stuff. So this means that whenever we make a call to the dev server that starts with -API, we're going to proxy it to our Flask URL or to our Flask server. And this Flask URL, of course, comes from our environment variables file, which is this location right here. Next, we have our module key. And this is essentially just used to tell Webpack how to handle certain modules. And here we're saying that for all JavaScript and all JSX files, and actually I need to escape this. So for all files ending in .js and .jsx, excluding node modules, we want to pass them through the Babel loader, which will essentially just turn it into JavaScript code that the browser will then understand. And then we add our presets to configure this transpiler. And then finally, we just have our resolve key, which will make it so we can import JS and JSX files without there being any kind of issue. But that's all it takes to configure Webpack. So now we just need to start coding our React app. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to get our HTML code, and I'm just going to paste it in here. And the most important thing here is this div with the ID root, because we're going to use the React DOM to find this element and then render our React application inside of it. And we're going to do that inside our index.jsx file. So here, we're going to create a root with this div, and then we're going to render our app component inside it. And let's create our app component, and that's going to be components, and then app.jsx. And once again, I'm just going to paste the code in here, and let me go over what it does. It's not really anything special if you're familiar with React. Essentially, we just have some state for our users, and also if we have loaded the users or not. When the component mounts, so we use useEffect with this empty dependency array, we're going to create an abort controller. In case the component unmounts, then we will want to stop this fetch API, so we don't set any state on an unmounted component. And actually, I need to add a return where if our component unmounts, we're just going to abort the API call. But we make a call to API-users, which will be proxied to our Flask server, and then it'll send a JSON response, and we just set our users with it. If anything goes wrong, we'll just log out an error, and no matter what happens, we're going to set loaded to be true. And loaded users will essentially just determine if we're displaying our users array or just the string loading ... And that's our entire React app. Next thing we just need to do is create a start script. And for that, inside script right here, let's just use the start key. And what we are going to run is our Webpack dev server. So I'm going to paste it right here. So Webpack dev server, we're going to pass open, which basically just means open a new tab when we run it. And then the configuration is our Webpack configuration file. But that is it for our React app. So our React app should be good to go. Now let's create our Python Flask server. And so I'm going to do this in a folder called server, which will be our API server. And the first thing I'm going to do is just navigate there. And now let's set up a Python virtual environment. And we want to do this, of course, so that all the packages we install and everything is just local to this environment. And the way we're going to do this is we run Python 3-m, which means run a package essentially. And we're going to run the .venv package, virtual environment, and place its content in a folder called .venv. So this creates a .venv file or a hidden file with all this information, which we can use to activate our virtual environment. And we can do that with .source.venv bin activate. And now we can see we are in our virtual environment. So when we install our required packages, it'll just be specific to this environment. And the ones we're going to install is going to be Flask, Python.env, and also Pymon. So Flask, of course, will be our web framework. Python.env will be to load environment variables, and Pymon will be to make the development process easier with live updates. But now inside here, let's create our source code, so our source folder, and we're going to do a server.py file. And then similar to what I did with everything else, I'm just going to paste in this code and just explain what's going on here. And so essentially, all we're going to do is we're going to, from Flask, import Flask in response, import JSON to work with JSON data, and import load.env to load our environment variables, which we're going to do right here. Then we create our app Flask, and we're just going to have a root API-users, which is being called, if you can remember, in our app component right here, which will be proxied to our Flask server, which will then have this users array that it will return to the React app. And then down here, we're just going to set a custom host and port number, or host name and port number, which will be, once again, these environment variables. And that's really all there is to it. So our API server is a lot easier to handle. But now what we need to do is just run both of these and cross our fingers that everything's working fine. So what we do is we have our Webpack server over here and our Flask API server over here. First, let's run our Python server because we want our API server up and running for our React app. We're going to do source-server.py. And there we go. We're running on localhost 1235. And now let's start our Webpack dev server. And we are running on 1234. And it opened up this in another tab. But here we are. Here's our users. So this is them right here. This is my Chrome extension if you're curious. So something cool we can use is we can see our API call here. So this one right here is what was sent. Open up this a bit wider. And we send this. Let's see what the response was. And these are all the users. And of course, this came from the Python server right here. And then our React app is just rendering everything. So we can send this and just keep seeing the response. And we can also see it showing up here. So we send this. Here's the API request. But anyway, whenever we refresh this, we get these list of users. And say you want to add another one, just like this. Then we refresh the page. And the reason it's actually not updating is because we used Python to run it, when what we should have done is use Pymon, because that's why we installed it. So that's what was going on there. But so we do source server.py. Okay, now let's try this again. So if we refresh this, there's the new user. Let's add another one, Bob. We can see the changes are reflected. And if we run this, there's the user Bob. Cool. This is all it takes to create a custom React app and connect it to Flask. If you like content like this, check out my courses and also my Chrome extension. Links in the description. Besides that, thank you for liking and subscribing. Have any comments, leave them any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll try and get back to you. Besides that, take care. Have a good one.